Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this third day of our workshop. Again, I'm very pleased that you're here, and I am grateful to you for coming back for a third day. So this is the last day this week where I am going to be talking to you for most of the session, and I'm going to try and do two things today. So on Monday and on Tuesday, I gave talks that aimed to introduce some of the concepts and the ideas underlying scenario analysis and underlying the sort of thinking that goes into scenario analysis. So I talked a little bit about cognitive biases and heuristics and the work of Daniel Kahneman, and I talked a little bit about things like black swan events and anti-fragility. And the idea is to essentially introduce you to some of the concepts that underpin the theoretical foundations of scenario analysis. So we talked about scenario analysis, particularly on Monday, but we haven't yet really gone into depth in terms of what scenario analysis involves and how scenarios are developed, how analysts, consultants, strategic leaders develop scenarios. So that is what we are going to do today. Really, there are two aims of today's session. I want to take an opportunity to review some of the key ideas that we've covered this week, and to sort of emphasize some of the key principles that underpin scenario analysis and underpin the methodology that I'm going to show you. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. So I'm going to go back to some of the slides in the PowerPoints on Monday and Tuesday, and I'm going to revisit some of the most important principles underlying scenario analysis to consolidate this part of the workshop. And then for most of the workshop today, what I'm going to do is show you the 8 steps in the Shell scenario analysis method. So the internal logics scenario method that was developed within Shell in the 1970s. And I'm going to talk you through the steps that groups follow when they produce scenarios. And this may seem quite abstract, and it might be challenging to sort of visualize in terms of how scenarios are actually produced. But the idea of this is to set the scene and to make sure that you are aware of the steps that need to be followed in producing a set of scenarios, so that tomorrow and on Friday, when we work together to produce a set of scenarios ourselves, you will understand the process that we're following. Normally, when I run workshops about scenario analysis, I work with groups of 6 or 7 people. So typically, there might be 3 or 4 groups. Each group will work together very closely to produce a set of scenarios, and I will work with them as they're doing that. This workshop is the first time that I have taught scenario analysis and talked about scenario analysis to such a large group of people. And that means that this sort of small group approach isn't going to work. So what does that mean? That means that we're going to do an experiment over the rest of this week, really. Today, I'm going to, as I say, introduce the key idea, the key steps in the methodology. And then tomorrow and on Friday, we are all going to work together as one big group to produce a set of scenarios. And I'm going to walk you through the methodology as we do that. And we're going to use an online tool that's called Google Jamboard in order to be able to do that work together. So tomorrow is going to be and Friday are going to be very participative, and you're going to be involved in writing things in the chat and in writing your ideas on the Jamboard and working with the Jamboard. But as I say, for today, for most of the session, I am going to talk to you. So as always, I would ask you to please mute your microphones so that we have as little background noise as possible. And I would ask you, even though your microphones are going to be muted, to take part as much as you can in the session. So you are very welcome to post questions and comments in the chat. It might be that as we go through some of the material from Monday and Tuesday again, there are some new ideas or new questions or new thoughts that come to you. And if so, that's great. That's what this is all about. And I would encourage you to post those in the chat as well. And we will either sort of visit the questions in the chat over the course of today's session, or we will spend some time at the end dealing with your questions and comments. We may well have a bit more time this evening for questions, comments, and discussions than we have on Monday or Tuesday. So just to revisit the core aims of the workshop and to sort of think about what we've done so far. My hope is that by looking at scenario analysis, you are more aware of some of the ways to facilitate and enable strategic thinking. I think that's really important. Strategic thinking isn't something that just happens. I hope that's become clear so far. Obviously, people in strategic roles are given a very particular job to do, and they are employed and they're well paid for their strategic planning skills. But nonetheless, the big challenge that a lot of organizations face, the big challenge that I face in my own role, and that I would imagine that some of you face, is finding the time and the space to engage in strategic thinking, to really think about the ideas that need to be taken into account in developing and implementing strategic plans. And one of the core aims, I would argue, of scenario analysis is to facilitate the time and the space for those sorts of strategic conversations. So I have already, over the past 2 days, talked a little bit about some of the issues that need to be taken into account when thinking strategically about the future. And very importantly, some of the mistakes that strategic leaders make when they are engaging in strategic thinking. And it might be that the biggest mistake that strategic leaders make is not giving themselves the time and the space to really think strategically. And now that I'm in a strategic role in my own university, in my own institution, I see that this is a pretty serious problem. There are so many day-to-day issues that need to be dealt with, problems that need to be solved, that finding the time to actually work strategically is very challenging. And that's something that we'll talk about today. We've talked a little bit about pestle analysis, and we've talked a lot yesterday about political risk analysis. And as we saw on Monday, and as we'll revisit today, scenario analysis fundamentally is about exploring, examining, analyzing the contextual environment that that an organization operates in. So exploring in depth the aspects of the business environment that are outside of its control, and thinking about how the way that they change might affect implementing strategies or might affect strategic plans in themselves. So those are the two areas that sort of underlie scenario analysis that we've already been talking about. And then yesterday, we started talking a little bit about how some organizations do scenario analysis. And on Monday, we talked about some of the principles underlying scenario analysis. Today, we're going to get far deeper into how scenario analysis is done and what the steps are in the methodology. Then on Thursday and on Summer Friday, we're going to work on developing a set of scenarios. So we're going to do a practical exercise. And we will close on Friday by thinking about how the scenarios that we have produced might impact strategic thinking within an organization. So to review some of the key ideas from Monday or Tuesday, we started off by exploring how people think about the future in their day-to-day working lives. And then we looked yesterday at how the consultants whose job it is to make judgments about the future, specifically to make judgments about how political and macroeconomic risk might evolve over time. We looked at how they do their work. So we've already talked quite a lot about how people think about the future. And we talked a little bit about the difference between forecasting and scenario analysis, because very often forecasting and scenario analysis are kind of framed as two fundamentally different ways to sort of think about the future when we engage in planning. But we saw yesterday when we talked about political risk analysis, and particularly how expert judgment feeds into political risk analysis, that the thing that links scenario analysis and strategic planning is the whole issue of thinking about the future as one single thing. And the problem is that actually, you know, when a forecast is produced, or when an expert makes a judgment about something, or for that matter, when a plan is made, if that plan is based on one possible future, then it's probably not going to be very reliable, because the future can unfold in multiple different ways. You know, there are multiple different paths that the future can take. Unexpected things can happen, unexpected things do happen. So the reason why scenario analysis is such a compelling methodology is that it sees the future in terms of there being multiple futures and not a single future. And that's very important. And I would argue that more generally than a discussion about scenario analysis, in any aspects of our lives, if we think about the future as being something that is in the plural rather than in the singular, that will change the way that we think about the future, and it will change the way that we plan for the future. And this, I think, is very important, that the principles underlying scenario analysis can be used in all aspects of life. So scenario analysis is typically presented as a strategy tool. Sometimes it's presented as a tool for analysis of political economy or analysis of climate change. The principles underlying scenario analysis can be used for anything. And they can be used in our personal lives as well as in these kind of professional areas. And then we talked about how scenario analysis is fundamentally something that is helpful over the kind of medium-term future. So we talked about how in the short term, forecasting can actually be relatively reliable, because there are more things that we do know about what's going to happen in the short term than that we don't know. There are more predetermineds than uncertainties. Over time, that sort of mix of predetermined versus uncertainty changes, and there starts being more that we don't know than that we do know, and that's where scenario analysis is helpful, hence the S in the graph. But if we go too far out into the future, beyond, say, a 15-20 year horizon, there are too many uncertainties, not enough things that we do know. And at that point, we're really into the sort of field of science fiction. It's impossible to make plausible judgment calls about the future, because there's just not enough that we know about what the world will be like by that point. So scenario analysis is generally used for analysis that happens over between a 5 and a 20-year time horizon. In the exercise that we do tomorrow, we are going to look at what we're going to look at the world between now and 2035. So 2035 will be the end point in our scenarios tomorrow, because that is kind of not that is too far into the future for any kind of forecasting to be useful. But at the same time, there's enough there are enough things that that we already know in areas like demographics, and the balance between what we know and what we do know is such that we can actually come up with plausible, useful scenarios over that time frame. So that's what we're going to do tomorrow. And as you will remember, the aim with scenario analysis is not to predict the future, but I would say that the aims of scenario analysis are threefold. The first aim of scenario analysis is as a way to analyze, evaluate, assess strategic options. So it's a way to stress test possible strategies and see how they withstand environmental turbulence. An analogy that's often used with scenario analysis is that of a wind tunnel. So when a new plane is designed and developed, it's put through a wind tunnel. The university where I used to work had a wind tunnel in its engineering department. And the idea is that putting the plane through a wind tunnel allows an understanding of how that plane will withstand turbulence in the environment. So wind tunnels are an important part of developing planes. Scenario analysis could be seen as a sort of wind tunnel for strategy. So the idea is that you use your scenarios to see how your strategic ideas and strategic plans would withstand turbulence in the business environment. Scenario analysis is also useful in terms of providing an early warning that things aren't going according to plan, and making people sort of aware as a group, having undertaken the scenario analysis, of the need to be agile and to change course, if you like, change plans at as early a stage as possible, when it appears that things aren't going according to plan. But then also, very importantly, scenario analysis is not about predicting the future. And I hope it's clear from the conversation over the past couple of days that none of these foresight methods that I introduced on Monday and that I talked about yesterday are about predicting the future. You can't predict the future. And I find it frustrating when consultancies, and it usually is consultancies, claim that they can predict the future, because that's not possible. What scenario analysis is really useful for is understanding the present. So my starting point is that scenario analysis is as much about the present as it is about the future. It's about using the stories of multiple futures that are produced to get a better understanding of what the world is like now. And then scenario analysis also involves teams of people working together. And the idea is that in the quite intense, deep conversations that are part of scenario analysis. People's thinking is challenged, and the cohesion of the group that works together to produce the scenario increases, which helps, for example, groups of senior leaders within organizations to prepare or to be better placed to deal with challenging situations, environmental turbulence in the future. So scenario analysis is fundamentally about how the things that we don't know interact with the things that we do know. The system of relationships that I talked about yesterday from my research, and it's about looking at how different stakeholders behave as these sort of driving forces, the things that we don't know, the uncertainties, and the things that we do know play themselves out. So that is, there's a lot more to scenario analysis than that, but that's fundamentally what scenario analysis is all about. And as I said, scenario analysis is about the contextual environment. It's about the business environment. So scenarios generally aren't produced about organizations themselves, but they're produced about the environment in which organizations operate, and specifically the contextual environment. So in other words, the elements of the environment in which an organization is operating that are outside of its control. So that's a very brief review of the principles underlying scenario analysis. If you look on YouTube or Vimeo, there are a number of examples of scenario analysis exercises in practice. The best one, I think, is a set of scenarios that was produced quite a long time ago about the global fashion industry. And this was a sort of group exercise that followed the methodology that I am going to explain, that I'm going to show you over the rest of today's session, to produce 4 really interesting scenarios about how the fashion industry might evolve between when the scenarios were produced in 2025. And then for each scenario, a video was produced. One of the key challenges, if you're coming up with stories about the future, is how you're going to present those stories. Sometimes it's a traditional PowerPoint presentation, sometimes it's a report, sometimes it's a brochure. In this case, the scenarios were presented on videos. And there are links to the 4 videos on this slide. So these slides from today are available either in the classroom or through the Google Drive. And what I would like you to do, this is the first homework, if you like, from this workshop. Each of these videos is about 1 minute long, maybe 2 minutes long maximum. And what I would like you to do between now and when we meet tomorrow is to try to watch each of these 4 videos. So you can get the links from the presentation, which is available in the classroom or on the Google Drive. And I would like you to watch each of those 4 videos, because my hope is that by seeing an actual scenario analysis that has been done, and that has been done by scenario analysis professionals, you will better understand what a set of scenarios looks like. So that's a very brief review of the principles behind scenario analysis. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to, well, I can see that there's actually only one question and that question is, how can we define the comfort width of the range of uncertainties to make the forecasting useful? Okay, that is a good question. The point about scenario analysis is, so first of all, most forecasting is either single point. So there's either a single forecast, or there's a very small forecast range. So for example, inflation forecasts in Mexico are often presented in terms of there being a range of of possible sort of inflation figures. And the range that's used there is 2 percentage points. So, for example, between 1% and 3%. Some people would say that that is too wide, but nonetheless, you very rarely you very rarely see a wider range of or forecasting range to that. Usually, it's much more specific. And then what happens, especially with government forecasts, is that after the first forecast is produced, a revised forecast is produced sometime later, which essentially updates the original forecast based on new information that's available between when the first forecast was produced and then. Now, the point about revised forecasts is that they're a sort of admission that the original forecast was wrong. But as we said on Monday, an awful lot of strategic leaders are happy with the idea that forecasting is frequently wrong, provided they've got a sort of hard number to deal with. Scenario analysis is a bit different. So in scenario analysis, the way I'm going to show you, there is no modeling of any kind. So we're not working with principles of probability, which is what fundamentally it underlies forecasting. It's a combination of probability and sort of time series analysis. That's a bit of an oversimplification because some forecasting models can be very complex, but fundamentally, I would argue that's what forecasting is all about. Now, with scenario analysis, it's not about probability, as I say. Instead, it's about, I would argue, two things. Scenario analysis is about possibility. It's about the things that could happen rather than the probability of something happening. And whether or not something could happen is fundamentally a judgment call that the people producing the scenarios have to make. So in that sense, the sort of range of issues and outcomes that a set of scenarios could cover depends on the group that's producing the scenarios. And you could have, one of the interesting things when I do smaller workshops in my own institution is that you can have 3 or 4 groups doing the same scenario analysis or a scenario analysis on the same issue. The different groups produce very different scenarios. And that's because the range of possible futures that a group doing a scenario analysis can come up with is almost sort of limitless. So scenario analysis is partly about possibility, but then more importantly than that, scenario analysis is about plausibility. So what do I mean by plausibility? If something is plausible, that means that the group believes that it is realistic. And essentially, a key question that any group of people needs to ask itself again and again and again as it's undertaking a scenario analysis, particularly towards the end of the process when you're actually developing the scenarios, is, do we believe that this is plausible? Do we believe that this is a realistic scenario? Is this credible? And this concept of being plausible is a relatively wide one. And what it means is that essentially, if a group producing a set of scenarios believes that something is plausible, and very importantly, if they believe that their client, because scenario analysis is always produced for a client, if their client believes that it's plausible, then it's fine. And that's a qualitative judgment that the group collectively needs to make. And in any scenario analysis, there needs to be a debate within that group about whether the scenarios that are being produced are plausible. So the answer to your question is essentially that there is no answer, except that whatever a group doing scenario analysis does has to be plausible in their view and in the likely view of their client. And that's the starting point for scenario analysis, this idea of plausibility. And that is really, really important. And on that note, like I said, scenario analysis is fundamentally about a strategic conversation, but the idea of the scenario analysis methodology is to provide a sort of structured framework through which that strategic conversation takes place, and to provide a pretty clear indication of what outputs are expected at the end of that strategic conversation. So that means, you know, we've all had conversations, I'm sure, over the course of our lifetimes that have been interesting, often relatively profound, but which have lacked focus. I always find it interesting to, or I sometimes find it interesting to talk to the person that I'm sitting next to on a plane. And I find that you can have the most amazing conversations with strangers that you're sitting next to on a plane. But you get off the plane, you sort of go about your life, and that conversation is just sort of left there. And that's the problem with a lot of conversations. The structured methodology in scenario analysis is about, like I say, providing a framework in which that conversation can take place, and providing a purpose for that conversation, so that there is, like I said, a clear set of outputs that will emerge from the process and that will sort of stay at the end of the process. So the Shell scenario method, the method that was developed within Shell in the 1970s, which, like I've said, is the dominant method that's used for developing scenarios today, essentially has 8 steps, which we are going to go through today. And the first step, and this is very important, is that there needs to be a conversation between the client, the participants in the scenario analysis exercise, the scenarios team, if you like, and the facilitators of the scenarios exercise, who are usually consultants. There are quite a lot of consultants that specialize in scenario analysis. There needs to be a conversation about what the focus of the scenarios is going to be. And because the scenarios tend to focus on the environment rather than on the organization itself. The environment might be a sector like the fashion industry, it might be a country. So there's a very famous set of scenarios that was produced in the late 1980s about South Africa, or it could be a city or a region. So I live near the city of Birmingham, which is the second city in the UK. And recently there was a scenario analysis exercise about the city of Birmingham. The city of Birmingham was the subject of the scenarios. It's important to kind of get that right, to come up with an issue or an area in the business environment that will produce a set of scenarios that will be useful to the client. So what I propose for the scenario exercise that we're going to do is to keep the topic of the scenarios relatively broad. So what we're going to think about over the rest of this week is a set of scenarios for Peru as a country between now and 2035. Because that is, as I say, a broad subject, but it should be a subject that everybody here can talk about, and that will produce some insights and an outline set of scenarios. We haven't got time to produce a full set of scenarios, but an outline set of scenarios that will be relevant and interesting, and perhaps even useful to as many possible people in the room. Having decided the issue to discuss, for our purposes, I've told you what I think the issue should be. I'm happy to hear your questions and comments about that issue. So if any of you have any thoughts, please write them in the chat. The first step in the scenario development process is to think about what the forces are that will drive change in the subject of the scenarios over the time frame that you're talking about. So we're going to need to think about what the forces are, so the issues, the players, the influences, things like that, that will drive change in Peru between now and 2035. And the first part of a scenario analysis exercise is a straightforward brainstorming exercise, where first of all the group as the members of the group as individuals, and then the group as a whole, will try to identify as many things as possible. And at that point in the process, the idea is to come up with as much as possible, as many ideas, as many driving forces as possible. Then the next stage is to try and narrow the focus a bit as we work towards being able to produce our scenarios. So next, there's a process, a conversation within the group about collecting together, grouping together the driving forces identified into themes, and identifying what the big ideas, the big themes, the big driving forces are that emerge from the first step of the process. So this is really important. The first step is identifying the driving forces. We'll talk more in a moment about what those driving forces are. The next step is to group those driving forces together, to cluster them, and to identify themes, the big themes, the macro level, big driving forces that are coming forward, and to think about what the extreme outcomes of those driving forces are. So we'll talk in a moment about the idea of a driving force. And the key idea of the driving force is movement. So if you drive a car, the car moves. If you drive anything, a car, a boat, whatever, the vehicle moves. And the idea of a driving force is that it can move between two extreme points. So for example, if economic growth is a driving force, it can be high or low. Those are the two extreme events. If climate, if damage to the environment's a driving force, the damage can either be severe or mild. Those are two extremes. And by the end of that step, what we should have are somewhere between 8 and 12 large driving forces, macro level driving forces. And then what we need to do is to analyze those even further. And we do that by ranking them according to impact. So trying to identify which of the driving forces are highest impact and which are lowest impact, and creating a ranking from the lowest impact to the highest impact. And again, I'll talk in a moment about how we do that. And then we also rank the driving forces according to how certain or uncertain we are that they will happen. So there are some things, this is where we get into the whole issue of predetermined factors versus critical uncertainties. There are some things like demographics where between now and 2035 is a 13-year time frame, where we pretty much know what's going to happen over the next 13 years. There are other things where we have no idea. So, what will Peruvian politics look like in 13 years' time? Who knows? What will politics anywhere look like in 13 years' time? It's impossible to know. So having ranked the themes that we've identified, the big driving forces, we then need to choose two of them which are very, very high impact and where there's a very high level of uncertainty. And then essentially what we do is we build 4 stories by looking at how the extreme outcomes of those two big driving forces that we identify intersect. And I'll explain to you a bit more specifically what we mean by that when we get to that point. And then having done that, a very large part of a scenario analysis is developing and writing the stories for each of the scenarios. Remember that scenario analysis is fundamentally storytelling. It's coming up with 4 different narratives, 4 different stories about how the future might unfold. And then it's very important to think about how to present those scenarios to the client. And if you watch those 4 videos about the fashion scenarios, you will see an example of how a scenario analysis can be presented once it's been done. So that's the process as a whole. And I've given you a broad sort of overview of the process as a whole. What I want to do now is to go into some of the details of the process. And by the way, in the Google Classroom or in the Google Drive, you'll see that I have included a handbook or a workbook on scenario analysis. And what you will find in that workbook is a sort of summary of the scenario analysis method that I'm presenting to you now. So you will have a sort of document after this workshop's finished, which explains how scenario analysis is done, and which, if any of you do scenario analysis in your work, you're able to refer to. So you'll have noticed that a key principle underpinning scenario analysis is driving forces. And basically the whole sort of scenario production process is about working with driving forces. So it's worth spending a little bit of time thinking about what we mean by driving forces. And essentially, I think there are 2 things. The fact that they're forces, a force exerts pressure on something, and that pressure causes change. So the idea of a force is one of change. And the idea of a driving force, like I say, if you think about driving, when you drive, you're moving. If you drive a vehicle, the vehicle's moving from one point to another. So it's very important to frame driving forces in terms of movement. So if you look at the examples on this slide, sea level in itself is not a driving force, because there's no way of framing that in terms of change, in terms of movement. Impact of sea level on the rate of coastal erosion. The word impact is important there, because you can have 2 extremes. You can either have a high impact or a low impact. And you can have movement between those 2 extremes. So something can start off being high impact and can become low impact over time. An example of that over history is terrorist movements. When terrorist movements are active and are carrying out attacks, their impact is very high. If you think about terrorist movements both in Peru and here in the United Kingdom, Ireland, they're still sort of there. There's something that we need to be aware of and keep an eye on, but nonetheless, their impact now is relatively low. It's lower than it used to be. So driving forces can change, and you can have movement in either direction. And it's important to, when you think about a driving force, to think about what its extreme outcomes are. But at the same time, it's also important to go into a scenario analysis exercise with as open a mind as possible. So, I don't like, for example, to think about best case and worst case scenarios in a scenario analysis exercise. I don't think, I think making that judgment about whether something is a good scenario or a bad scenario, or whether a driving force is a positive or a negative driving force, is a difficult one to make, because that movement might change over time, like I said. And quite simply, what is a good scenario for one person or for one group or one organization? What's a best case scenario for one organization can be a worst case scenario for another organization. So if you take the example of the UK leaving the EU, which we've talked about, for many organizations that trade with the EU, and for many individuals that have dealings with the EU, it has been a very negative thing. And you could sort of talk about what's happened as being a worst case scenario. For others, so, for example, for low skilled workers whose wages have gone up, or for investors whose investment portfolios have gone up because of the currency being weak, it's been a very good scenario. So, there you have an example of something that's a good scenario for some people and a bad scenario for other people. And the reason why I say that is it's important not to think of scenario analysis in terms of best case or worst case scenarios, or to too early think about how the driving forces should move. But nonetheless, the first step in any scenario analysis is about identifying driving forces. So the driving forces, like I said, are the things that will drive change in whatever the scenarios are about over the time period. So our scenarios are going to be about Peru to 2035. And what we need to do is to identify what some of the drivers of change over that period are going to be. And that is a brainstorming exercise. Lluvia de ideas. And normally what happens is, scenario analysis is something that groups of people do in a room together. And scenario analysis uses a lot of things like post-it notes. And usually what happens is that a group thinks about different driving forces. Each driving force is written on a post-it note and stuck on a wall. And the idea at this point is to identify as many things as possible. By using Jamboard, we're going to work with post-it notes, but they're going to be virtual post-it notes. Now, a useful starting point in terms of determining driving forces might be a pestle analysis. But you don't have to limit yourself to that. And the idea is to think about as many things as possible. And like I say, at this point, it's about identifying ideas. It's not so much about plausibility. The discussion about plausibility can come later. So the idea is that by the end of this part of the process, you'll have a wall that will be covered in post-it notes. And then the next stage in the analysis is to cluster those. So the idea is to move the post-it notes into groups based on having sort of things in common, having synergies, if you like. So this is where the conversation really starts. There's likely to be a conversation about what the driving forces are that you identified in the first place. But at this point, you're thinking about the linkages, the connections between the driving forces, and you're grouping them together. And the idea is that and you're thinking about things like how one driving force might influence another driving force, and how you could have possible chains of events where one driving force leads to another driving force. So by the end of this step, what you're probably going to have are between 8 and 12 groups of the driving forces that you identified in the first step. And then what you have to do is to think about what the big idea is in each group. So the idea is that by the end of this part, you have between 8 and 12 sort of big driving forces, big themes. And the idea is that you look at the collection of driving forces and you think, what's going on here? What's the big idea here? And that you allow themes to emerge from the groups of driving forces that you've identified. And so, as I say, by the end of this process, what you should have are somewhere between 8 and 12 big macro level themes that are your kind of macro level driving forces. And then at this point, remember that we talked about driving forces as being all about movement. The idea of driving is movement from one place to another. The idea of a force is that a force exerts pressure and that pressure produces change. So you're probably going to have between 8 and 12 driving forces, big driving forces. You're going to have a load of post-it notes on the board. You're going to have people standing around talking about those. And then for each of those driving forces, what you need to do is to identify what the two extreme outcomes are. And that usually involves words like high and low, fast and slow. So if one driving force is economic growth, or the speed of economic growth, the speed of economic growth could be fast or slow. The level of economic growth could be high or low. If the driving force is about the role of government, the role of government could be interventionist, or it could be laissez-faire, leave alone. For each of the driving forces that you identified, you need to identify what the extreme outcomes are, and that's very important, and that's something that we will do tomorrow. And then having done that, what you should have are, like I said, between 8 and 12 big driving forces with their two extreme outcomes. And then at this point, scenario analysis starts working with 2x2 matrices, with these matrices. And the next stage in the process is to rank the big driving forces that you've identified according to impact. So basically what you do is you take the, between 8 and 12 driving forces and you put them in a line from the lowest impact to the highest impact. Now, when we talk about impact, what we're talking about is impact on the key issue being explored in the scenario analysis over the timescale that you've identified. So in our case, it'll be the impact on how Peru will change between now and 2035. But in terms of the specific elements of impact, they can vary quite a lot depending on each group. So basically, as a group, those doing scenario analysis need to agree on the factors that determine impact. And at the end of this, what you need to have is a line that goes from lowest impact to highest impact. And typically what will happen, what we'll do tomorrow, is we'll draw one of these matrices and we will put our post-its in a line from lowest impact to highest impact. And then having ranked for impact, the next thing we need to do is to rank for the level of uncertainty, certainty or uncertainty. So basically what we mean there is if one of the driving forces that we've identified is something that we are absolutely sure is going to happen over the time frame. So if it's something that in our case is going to happen between now and 2035, then it's high certainty. We have a high level of certainty. If it's something that we don't know about, So, what kind of government will Peru have in 2035? What sort of policies will that government be trying to implement? How will relations between government and business work? It's very difficult for us to have any idea about that. So that would be at the bottom end. And the idea is that in the end of this process, you have a ranking according to impact. So you have things in a line from lowest impact to highest impact. And then you have a second ranking that goes from most certain to least certain. And the reason why we do that is twofold. It's to facilitate a conversation about what we mean by impact and what we mean by and what we think the impact and the level of certainty is. So that deepens the conversation. It deepens the analysis that happens in the conversation. But then to produce the scenario analysis, what we have to do is to work with two specific driving forces. And those driving forces are those with the highest impact and the lowest level of certainty, the most uncertainty. So you can see here that we've identified factor A and factor B, and they are in the bottom right-hand corner of this diagram, of this matrix. And the idea is that those are the two things that will have the highest impact, but that we're least certain about. So the two things that are in the most extreme bottom right-hand corner of the diagram. So we need to identify those two things that we're going to work on. And those two things also have to be unrelated to each other. So sometimes a group will just identify the two factors that are highest impact and least certain, and that's easy. But they also have to be two things that are unrelated to each other. And there might need to be some conversation where you have, where factor A and factor B are things that are somewhat related to each other. It might be that the group needs to choose a different factor. So there needs to be a factor C, for example. And then having done that, you've got the two extreme outcomes from each of the driving forces that you've identified, which you've defined a couple of steps ago. And what you're interested in is what the world will look like when each of those two extreme outcomes of the two driving forces interact. So you can see a picture there. You've got factor A on the y-axis, and you've got factor B on the x-axis. And you're going to have two. You're going to have four sort of starting points for your scenarios: A1, B1, A1, B2, A2, B1, A2, B2. I'll show you what that means in practice. And essentially what you can do then is to start brainstorming what the world would look like in each of those four frames. So to give an example of a real scenario analysis exercise, this is the matrix from a scenarios exercise about the energy sector, and specifically about government policy towards the energy sector. So, scenarios about the energy sector. The two big driving forces that were identified were, number one, government policy towards the government approach to the energy sector, to the energy industry. The two extreme outcomes there were dirigiste, which means interventionist, or laissez-faire, which means non-interventionist. And then in this particular exercise, the other big driving force that was identified, and we talked about camisea the other day, is the development of natural gas. The sort of outlook for natural gas development. The two extreme outcomes there are favorable and unfavorable. So in this case, scenario one is about what the energy sector would look like if you had an interventionist government and a favorable environment for natural gas. And you can start coming up with a story about that. Scenario 2 is about if you had a non-interventionist, laissez-faire government, but a favourable outlook for natural gas development. And you can tell a story about that, about a free-for-all as firms jostle for position in the natural gas sector, as opposed to in scenario 1, government aggressively pushing natural gas development. So you've got 2 storylines there. Then scenario 3 is all about what the world would look like if you had an unfavorable environment or outlook for natural gas development, but an interventionist dirigiste government. And there, I would imagine that the scenario would be about the government aggressively promoting other kinds of fossil fuels and alternative forms of energy, and possibly neglecting the natural gas sector more than it should. Whereas scenario 4 is about a non-interventionist approach from government, a laissez-faire approach from government, and an unfavorable outlook for natural gas development. So there you would probably have complete neglect of the natural gas sector because it's not profitable for energy companies, and a very strong focus on oil and perhaps on renewables. So you have there sort of outline to develop 4 possible scenarios, and then you need to scope those scenarios. So what groups normally do is start off by brainstorming, a bit like what I've just done, brainstorming what will the world look like with each of those 4 starting points, and then developing that brainstorming into a detailed storyline for each of the scenarios. And when developing that storyline, the key thing is, another principle underpinning scenario analysis that we haven't talked about yet is systems thinking. So basically it's about how the different driving forces, because you're drawing on all of the driving forces that you've identified here, how they create a timeline between now and the end point in the scenarios, and what the cause and effect relationships are that lead from now to the end point in the scenarios. And essentially, the important thing to remember there is, like I say, we're dealing with a timeline, but sometimes we assume that a timeline for anything will be linear. And actually, we don't live in a linear world, which means that it may be necessary to think about how lots of different driving forces intersect, what the kind of circular relationships are as well as the linear relationships, and what sort of offshoots there are. So to think of each scenario as a system, and to use a systems thinking approach to look at the cause and effect relationships. And the idea, to do this properly takes quite a long time. But the idea is that at the end of it, you have 4 detailed, rich storylines which you will present to the client. And it's important to think really at quite an early point in the process of developing the scenarios, how you're going to present the scenarios to the client. And what you can see if you watch the videos of the 4 scenarios for the fashion industry, is that it's possible to be quite creative in terms of how scenario analysis is presented, because the important thing, what you really need when you present your scenarios, is to get the buy-in of your client, for your client to believe in those scenarios and to use those scenarios to influence their strategic thinking and planning, and to influence other aspects of their work. So that's the scenario development process. And that is what we are going to undertake over the over the next 2 days. I can see that there are some comments in the chat, so I may talk a bit today about how we can use scenarios, but I'd like to spend a bit of time on answering your questions, and sort of discussing what I've talked about with you now. So it may be that we talk about using scenarios at the end of the session on Friday. So please, if you have any questions, write them in the chat. So okay, so we talked about the whole issue of the range of uncertainties, and the difference between forecasting and scenario analysis in that regard. The next question is the discussion on the steps performed by the actors, which are referred to as the strategic conversation. The point about scenario analysis, I mean, this idea of strategic conversation is really important. What I regard as the most important book on scenario analysis is this one by Kurt van der Heijden. I was very lucky in that when I did the scenario analysis program that I did at the University of Oxford, Kurt van der Heijden was one of the teachers. So he's the guy who taught me scenario analysis, which was a huge privilege. He came up with the idea of the strategic conversation, and the key point is that in each stage of the scenario development process, there needs to be that scenario analysis is a group exercise. The group works together, and the group is talking to each other throughout the exercise. So you've got the steps in the methodology, but apart from the kind of brainstorming of the driving forces at the very beginning, all of those steps involve conversation. And the idea is that the methodology itself, and the steps in the methodology and the structure of the methodology turn that conversation into a strategic conversation. So in other words, a conversation that has a strategic focus and that has strategic aims. So the whole of this scenario analysis process is about enabling and facilitating a strategic conversation. I think the code for the classroom has been shared. As far as I'm aware, you can only access the classroom if you have a San Marcos email address. If you don't have a San Marcos email address, then you need to access the material through the Google Drive. Would it be possible, my colleagues who are on the who are helping today, no sé si podrían compartir el link para el Drive. There's a link to the Google Drive. Hopefully one of my colleagues will share that. And someone has put the code for the classroom in the chat. That code, as far as I know, will only work if you have a San Marcos email address. Then there's lots of stuff about the attendance. I want to learn more about teaching through a hybrid method. I think what this question is getting at, this idea of the hybrid method. I mean, this is interesting, and this is something that I've done work on. Scenario analysis has always been it's a group activity. I hope that's clear. And scenario analysis has always been something that a group of people do in a room together. So if you would have asked me before the COVID pandemic whether scenario analysis could be done online, I would have said no. Or at best, I would have said it's very difficult for two reasons. First of all, the pictures that you saw in the presentation about the kind of flip charts and the post-it notes, and the post-it notes stuck on the wall, and the people standing around looking at the post-it notes on the wall. That's a really important part of the scenario analysis process, and the kind of moving around post-it notes and using the post-it notes as a way to sort of organize ideas. That's really important. And also, some people argue, I used to think this, I've changed my mind, that a conversation that happens in person is fundamentally different from a conversation that happens online. And that if you do things in person, you have a different kind of conversation. What I've discovered by both teaching scenario analysis and also doing scenario analysis over the past couple of years, when we've been doing so many things online that we used to do in person, is that actually it's quite possible to do scenario analysis online. I hope that will be clear in what we do tomorrow. What I must confess that I've never done is to do scenario analysis with such a large group of people. So that's going to be a bit of an experiment tomorrow. But I think a couple of things have happened. There are technologies available now, there's software available, which allows some of the physical tools of scenario analysis to be replicated. So in particular, there is whiteboard software with post-it notes that allow the kind of generation of post-it notes and moving around of post-it notes to happen. And that, I think, is really important. I also think that over the past couple of years, we have got used to talking to each other online. And in fact, there are advantages to the fact that so much of our work is done online. You know, not least the fact that I can be sitting in my office in my house in London, in the United Kingdom, talking to you now. And that me doing a session like this doesn't involve a very long flight and time away from home. So I think that's changed. I think the technology is better. The technology will only get better still. And that means that my view now is that it's perfectly possible to both do scenario analysis online and also to teach scenario analysis online. But it's important to sort of, I mean, scenario analysis, as I say, is all about conversation, and it's about using things like post-it notes and moving post-it notes around to enable that conversation. And it's important, I think, when you do scenario analysis to use the sort of online versions of those tools. I can see that yeah, I can see that there's a lot of traffic about the classroom and the Google Drive. The issue with the classroom, as somebody said, is that as far as I'm aware, the classroom only works if you are a member of San Marcos, either a student or a teacher at San Marcos. If you are not either a student or a teacher at San Marcos, you can't access the classroom. Which is why I have created a Google Drive document, and I'm hoping that the link for the Google Drive will have been shared with you, or perhaps if somebody could share the link to the Google Drive, that would be really great. But the classroom will only work if you are a student or a teacher at San Marcos. We've got another comment. The driving forces identification seems to be critical for the process. Some suggestions on the composition of the group. Okay, so in terms of the group, I would say scenario analysis is effective in groups of between about 6 and 10 people. You need enough people in the group for there to be a meaningful discussion debate, and strategic conversation. That's really, really important. So I've tried doing scenario analysis with smaller groups, 4 people, things like that. It doesn't work. That's not enough people to facilitate that kind of conversation. And also, in terms of the composition of the group, you really need a range of different stakeholders. So I would argue that you need you need people from multiple different levels within the organization. You probably need some external specialists. In the scenario literature, those people are known as remarkable people. What do we mean by remarkable people? That was the term that was coined within Shell. What we mean by remarkable people is people who have something very specific that they can contribute to the debate. So they may be academics, they may be consultants, or they may just be other people who have particular expertise or particular points of view. And then you are probably going to have people in the group who are sort of specialists in the process, who are specialists in the scenario analysis itself. And by the time you have a number of people from different levels of the organization, a number of these remarkable people, and a number of people who are specialists in the scenario analysis themselves, you need sort of between 6 and 10 people to have the sort of strategic conversation that I've been talking about, the sort of deep, rich conversation in which everyone can participate, but not only participate, also participate deeply. I would argue that if you have groups of much more than 10, you lose some of those elements. So the quality of each contribution, the quality of the overall interaction of the group, dynamic of the group, gets lost. So my answer to that would be what you need is between about 6 and about 10 people, including a combination of stakeholders, internal, external, from all levels of the organization, remarkable people, experts, in other words, and possibly specialists in the process, in the scenario analysis itself. How do you know if you have a valid forecast? That's a good question. In the case of forecasting, you know you have a valid forecast if the forecast turns out to be right. It's impossible to know whether you have a valid forecast until the forecast period has ended. Again, I think, forecasting isn't going to go away. Senior leaders within organizations require forecasts in order to sort of justify the decisions that they make, and in order to sort of have an excuse, if you like, if something goes wrong. But nonetheless, I think the key thing with forecasting, even if forecasting is not reliable in itself, is knowing when the forecasting has become unreliable, knowing when to revise the forecast or when to stop relying on the forecast. And I've seen a lot of companies, I've seen countries get into trouble by relying on forecasts that turn out to be incorrect. If you think about the idea of inflation targeting, essentially what that involves is interest rates being set based on a target, which in turn is based on a forecast for what inflation is likely to do. And if that forecasting in terms of inflation is wrong, and as a result the targeting is set wrongly, that causes problems. So in terms of knowing whether a forecast is right or wrong, you know that when the forecast period has ended. More important might be to identify the sort of weak signals that we talked about in relation to political risk and in relation to black swans that show you that you need to rethink the original forecast. What are the characteristics to take into account when choosing the experts for scenario analysis? I think there are two things. There is knowledge of whatever the thing that you're developing scenarios about involves. So if you're doing scenarios about the energy sector, then you're probably going to want a number of experts in the energy sector. You might want people who have expertise on different areas. So in the past, I've worked with specialists in oil and specialists in natural gas, for example. You may want to deliberately work with people who are going to present different points of view. So if you're working with economists, it might be that you want to work with somebody who's relatively orthodox and someone who is relatively heterodox, if you like. And the idea is to facilitate debate, which allows the group as a whole to come up with the kind of scenarios at the end. So I think that's important in terms of the subject experts, the remarkable people. And then I think the key thing otherwise is the range of stakeholders that are involved in the scenario production exercise. And that may mean that you have multiple groups working on different elements of the scenarios, and you have somebody who's kind of pulling everything together. That's what happened with the scenarios for the city of Birmingham. But essentially what you want are as many perspectives as possible, as diverse a background of people as possible. And then the idea is that enriches the conversation and enriches the range of perspectives that feed into that conversation. And that seems to be the end in terms of the questions. I'll just give a we're at 2:25, so we're very near the end of today's session anyway. Does anybody have anything else that they would like to ask? If not, then like I say, for one day only, there's a little bit of homework before tomorrow's session. So what I would recommend you do before tomorrow's session is, first of all, to watch the 4 videos about the fashion industry to see what a scenario analysis looks like in practice. And then if you have a chance, please either have a look at the slides that are available through the drive or through the classroom, or look at the workbook and try to read the workbook. Tomorrow, I thought about using breakout rooms. The problem with that is that different people have attended on each day. Those videos, the links to those videos are in the slides for today. So if you go to the drive or to the classroom, you'll see links to those videos. What I can possibly do, let me just what I can possibly do is I can share links to the 4 videos. Yep, I can. So I'm going to put links to the 4 videos now in the chat. You'll need to copy and paste those in order to be able to watch them. And this is the book. It's called Scenarios, The Art of Strategic Conversation. Details are actually in the material on the drive. And it's by Kees van der Heijden. And what I can do before we go is I can go to Amazon and I can send you a link. I can put in the chat a link to I can put a link to the book from Amazon into the chat so that you can see the details of it. So that's the book. There are a number of books about scenario analysis. I've included a list in the material on the drive or in the classroom. I would recommend this as the main book, as the key thing to read if you want to read one thing about scenario analysis. Are there any other questions at this point? If not, then thank you very much for attending today. Tomorrow is going to be different, so please come tomorrow ready to participate and interact. And like I say, the homework is to watch the 4 videos and to review the slides from today, or to review the workbook. I will see you tomorrow at the same time. Have a good day between now and tomorrow, and I will look forward to seeing you then.
Muchas gracias al doctor Neil. De esta manera estamos concluyendo entonces el seminario en su tercer día. Recordarles que los esperamos el día de mañana en el mismo enlace, por favor, y que cualquier consulta respecto a su asistencia u otra en particular que no tenga que ver con el taller en sí mismo, por favor, hacerlo a través del correo y evitar por este chat, por favor. Muchísimas gracias y entonces nos estamos encontrando el día de mañana. Gracias, doctor Neil.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Doctor.